Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nichole Atallah with PilieroMazza, and you are attending Teleworking in a COVID-19 environment. Your questions answered. Again, I am from PilieroMazza. I am the chair of the Employment Law Group at PilieroMazza. We're a full-service business law firm serving government contractors and commercial businesses. In addition to labor and employment, we have a number of great practice areas that are listed here, but today we really wanted to focus on the labor and employment side of things, particularly how your entire world has shifted to remote work, how that differs from work that the environments that we're used to performing in. I have been working at the firm for 10 plus years now and have fielded a lot of questions about telework and a number of other areas over the years. I'm sure right now everybody's focused on new legislation that's coming out. We've been doing a lot of that work, but we've been also starting to get the questions about how to manage and appropriately handle telework situations when you really haven't had employees acclimated to telework and you haven't been able to acclimate to a full law firm, or sorry, not a full law firm, a full, it tells you we're doing the same thing, right? A full company of folks that are on telework. So we thought it would be a good idea to really think about what you should be considering when you're allowing telework, not allowing telework. That's one of the primary issues we get, is that all of your employees are saying, I'm scared of this thing and I want to telework. And sometimes you have to allow folks to telework because you still have work to get done, and there's a state order or a federal order or local order that says that these folks have to be at home if they absolutely can be, or the option is to lay them off because they're not essential. Or you're working for a government client that's dictating how many of your folks can be teleworking and how many of folks have to be working on site. And you have employees that are scared about coming to work, and the question comes up, can I allow them to telework? So the things that we want to be considering when we're allowing telework is for government contractors, there is OMB guidance urging agencies to be flexible. So if you have a situation where your contract does not allow your employees to work remotely, you might want to consider asking the contracting officer to provide you exceptions and flexibility, maybe even modify your contract to allow more of your workforce to work from home. That's not going to work for all positions, right? If you're in construction or janitorial services or certain essential services, cleared positions, working in SCIFs, there are a number of positions that are not going to be able to telework. And you're going to have to communicate to employees that may not want to come to work that unless they fall under the new sick leave, FCRA sick leave guidelines, that they do have to come to work, that they're going to have to be on site. So those are difficult conversations to have, particularly when you have folks that feel like they're high risk. And we have to manage that to the extent that we can. But where employees who might otherwise not be able to telework can do some part or a majority of their job at home, I think it's important to be flexible and think more broadly in the past about how we have applied telework, right? In many cases, administrative assistants and administrative staff has not been able to telework. In many organizations have outfitted or figured out ways for those folks to work remotely, even when they weren't able to before. So I get calls frequently that say, person X wants to telework, it's not a telework position. And my next question to you is going to be why? Is it one of those obvious positions where, you can't perform cafeteria work at home or stocking work at home? Or is it a less obvious position which has just not been authorized to telework by a government client or by the company itself? And in that case, can we think more broadly about how that work can be accomplished remotely, or a majority of the work can be accomplished remotely? And is there a way, if you're a federal contractor, to work with your client to expand how we think about that position, relying in part on the OMB guidance. Hopefully, as this thing is going on, as COVID continues to be prevalent in our communities and increases, I think there has been more of a willingness to look at how we can be flexible with folks and how we can possibly accommodate specific situations. It's really critical that you communicate with the contracting officer if you're a federal contractor. They are your client. They are the ones that you are responsible for delivering services to. We don't want anyone to get in a situation where they are considered to be not completing deliverables or not meeting their contractual obligations because of telework. The question is, how can we facilitate those deliverables? How can we continue to serve the contracting officer and the programs as good as ever while still having folks at home? And it does require, in many cases, a little bit of a leap of faith that we can try things out and see if they work. Again, if we're communicating with the contracting officer on a frequent basis, we have more of a chance that that contracting officer will work with us and get those folks that can work at home working from home. At least tapping into that contracting officer to get their views on what types of positions are always going to be essential and have to be on site and which don't necessarily have to be on site. You should also think about what tools your folks are going to need. For example, I've talked to a couple of clients where they have very large operations that they basically had to retrofit folks at home to do their work. And that can be an undertaking. It can take a lot of planning and a lot of work in order to make sure that that people can perform their jobs and have the equipment that they need. Hopefully, you had been able to prepare for that for a few days at least. This kind of hit us very, very quickly. You should also know that if, for example, somebody needs a high-speed internet connection in order to get on your platform, for example, in order to do their work, and they don't have that at home, there could be a cost to the company in providing the resources to employees that they don't already have available to them. So you do not have to provide a computer, you don't have to provide a cell phone, you don't have to provide high-speed internet, but if an employee does not have certain equipment at home that they will need to perform their jobs, the Department of Labor has said that you may be responsible for equipping employees if you have them work remotely. So that's certainly something to keep in mind if special equipment is needed, or at least making sure that you plan in advance for things like paper and have employees take that home with them if they need certain things to work from home. So it's important that we think carefully about whether employees have the tools that they need so we're not setting them up for failure from the get-go. We also want to look to changes to our existing policies, right? So these are unique circumstances. I've mentioned before that these are not normal teleworking times where we would in the past have policies and say, sign this agreement and you agree that you're going to have a very carefully planned dedicated office space and you're going to agree that you're not going to have children at home while you're teleworking. Obviously, for many people, that is just not the world we live in right now. So what changes can we make to existing policies so that we're still getting the work that we need? We still have the time integrity that's required in order to do jobs and to do it well and to make sure that our clients are getting what they're paying for, but that we recognize that a number of folks do have children at home, are in very unique circumstances that may make it difficult for them to keep a specific schedule. So another consideration is whether schedules can be flexible or not flexible. Can an employee tell you, I'm going to work 6 to noon and then come online later in the evening? Is that going to be acceptable given the deliverables that that particular employee is responsible for? It is a really good idea to have a special set of policies that sort of amends what you already have in place for these specific circumstances. And it's important that if you do undertake changes to your policies or exceptions to your policies, that it's written down and it's specified that it's for a specified duration of time, that this is not intended to be a long-term exception to normal policies, that this is intended to be short-term until everyone can come back to work. And that when you tell folks that they need to be back on site, working on site, that's what's going to happen. So it's really important that we take into consideration where we might deviate from a normal telework policy in general. What happens when employees are ill? We need to communicate with employees that even if they're teleworking, if they're ill, we want them to get better and recover and tell us that they're ill. We don't want people avoiding the subject altogether. And there are employees that might be very careful to express when they are ill or they have a cough or a cold or the flu, right? Or COVID, because they don't want to be stigmatized, or particularly in the face of layoffs happening all around the country, they don't want to be the weakest link. So it's important that we cultivate a culture around communicating when you're ill or when you won't be able to work in line with your normal corporate policies. We want to keep them as consistent as possible. So what should be in a teleworking policy in general? So we want to talk about what positions might be eligible. If you have a lot of positions within your company, it might be that you, instead of putting a list of all the positions available, you say this is how you can determine whether your position would be eligible, or this is who you have to talk to in order to make sure the position is eligible. So it's going to be important that you communicate with your people how they will be able to determine whether their position is eligible or not for telework. For example, if you have a site supervisor, for example, and you have people working on site, you need that person on site supervising. That person might think that they can do most of their job at home. So it's important that you go and you look back at what the essential functions of the position are, whether that most of those functions or all of those functions can be handled remotely or not. And if it's really critical that that person be on site because they're supervising people on site, and there needs to be some interfacing there, then it's important to communicate to people what the restrictions might be. And it might be a case where you say, look, if this was 1 or 2 days, I might be able to let you telework. But if this looks like it could be for the foreseeable future, at least for possibly a month or two, and I can't. This is not one of those positions that can be done remotely for a long period of time. There are certainly some difficult conversations that come up in light of the fear that people have of contracting this virus. So I think a little bit of empathy is warranted and okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to give that person exactly what they want. But it is important to communicate somehow whether the position would be eligible. You should also address how somebody requests telework. Are they just going to be told they have to telework? Do they have to come and request it? How do they request it? Who do they direct those requests to? How will it be determined whether somebody's position is eligible or not? All of those things should be covered. And it doesn't have to be a long policy, but it should say how to request or get more information about telework. Return to work information is also very important. There are a lot of people, particularly younger people, that want to go home and be with family and shelter in place with family. And so it's important for them to understand what the expectation will be once it's determined that return to work is necessary or required, and that all of your normal policies would apply. Data protection should also be covered. Data protection is one of those areas that, it's a cybersecurity type of requirement, but it also comes into play significantly when you have people teleworking, because once people are teleworking or working remotely, the company's control over that data greatly decreases, right? And so it's important, particularly for people that are not used to teleworking, for them to get some guidance on how to best protect your company's data when they are teleworking, how to make sure that they are not accessing unsecured Wi-Fi networks, to make sure that they understand how they're supposed to be saving documents, where not to save documents, and to make sure that if they have sensitive data and they have a lot of people in their home, that they protect that data and it's not, your company's data is not destroyed or otherwise altered or taken in any particular manner. So that could be as simple as saying our data protection policy applies to you working from home, and we highly recommend that you review it. What I don't always like to see, because data protection is so important, I don't like to see policies that simply say all of our policies that are in our handbook apply. Is that sufficient from a does this policy cover it standpoint? Sure. Is it sufficient from a we're going to highlight what's really important for you to understand when you're teleworking? No, it's not, because employees are going to say, oh yeah, the handbook, right? I've read that thing maybe when I started 5 years ago. I know I get updates every year, but do I really read them? No, I just sign the acknowledgement, right? I only look at it when I really need to look at it. So if you want to establish a culture of data protection or a culture of communication, those things need to be in that policy. If the reporting structure isn't clear, the telework policy is a good way to reinforce who that person will be reporting to. So if you have a relatively porous reporting structure, it's a good idea to give an employee a point of contact that's going to check up with them on a regular basis. This is really important to keep the cohesion of your organization together, right? It's not just about somebody who's going to say you did this right or you did this wrong or this is good work and this is not good work. This is also because when you have an entire workforce that is remote, it's difficult. You know, it's a heavy lift for managers, but it's really, really critical that managers are constantly communicating with their team, constantly getting feedback on deliverables, checking to see how people are doing, even just, you know, on a day-to-day, hi, how are you basis. This type of scenario is very very mentally strenuous, and so it's a really good idea to have somebody that can talk to folks and be in contact with them. We did have a question come in, and the question is, so what if somebody has a combination of a reduced work schedule and telework because you're a caregiver and you have children home from school? Should we also fold in a part-time work policy? The question is a valid one. So you could reduce somebody to part-time. The other options they might have available to us come to play with the new FCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Act. And there are policies or provisions that if an employer allows telework, the employer can allow an employee to take intermittent extended FMLA and FCRA sick leave while also working. You have to agree to it, but in that particular case, at least for a period of 10 weeks, or possibly 12 weeks, depending on how the employee decides to take that first 2 weeks of leave, you could have a situation where employees are teleworking part-time and taking leave other time. That wouldn't reduce them to a part-time status. So that's just to say that, sure, there might be employees that need to go to a part-time status, but but if your organization is under 500 people, you very likely are going to be subject to the FCRA emergency sick and family leave, and in that particular case, somebody could extend their telework and leave in conjunction with one another for quite some period of time. So again, always can include a part-time policy. I would probably deal with the part-time folks on a case-by-case basis with respect to how they're going to be reporting time. But if you have specific policy issues with respect to part-time employees, that might be something that you can address as an option in your in a temporary telework policy, certainly. We want to make sure that employees know that even in this environment, it's really critical that there is compliance with company policies and deliverable expectations. And that goes also back to reporting structure as well, that employees need to understand that they will still be expected to do their jobs. And if you're chatting or texting with coworkers, whatever types of systems you might have available to keep your teams connected, that you can't discriminate, you can't harass, you can't use those tools for improper purposes. It's shocking to me how many situations that we see come across our desk that involve employees chatting with each other over text messaging or chat systems and kind of get into trouble from a sexual harassment standpoint. It raises some interesting questions for HR departments on how to administer an investigation when everybody's remote, but it's very doable. And so just like employees need to comply with company policies when you're remote, your HR and management teams are not exempt from their obligations just because everybody's remote. We still have to make sure that we promptly get those things taken care of, and that we are just as thorough as if we were looking somebody in the face. And there are a number of tools. I'm sure if anybody out there is like me, you've become a Zoom addict. I use Zoom for all sorts of things now. I'd never been on the platform before the COVID crisis broke out, but I find it to be extremely useful for seeing folks, and there is no substitute for some of that visual feedback sometimes. So I would encourage you to think also broadly about the types of tools you can use and that are low cost to the organization that can be employed to help everybody, get what they need to get done and stay connected. And we talked a little bit about notification of illness, but I think it's important that it's also in your policy. So the EEOC put out additional guidance about when you can ask employees about illness and symptoms. It is a good idea to include in either the policy or some communication with employees to notify you if they are ill or experiencing certain symptoms. You need to make sure that when you get that information from employees that you are careful with it. It's still medical information on behalf of those employees, but it's a good idea, at least particularly not only for the workflow, but particularly if you've had employees in contact with one another, that if one of them had COVID-like symptoms, that we can make sure that we have tried to identify whether anybody else in the organization needs to be notified. So what are some legal considerations and risks to keep in mind? Well, first of all, wage and hour concerns. You might have folks working at home that are hourly, that you might not have had working from home before. And for those particular hourly employees, you need to make sure that their timekeeping is true and accurate. If you're working on, federal contracts, even your exempt employees are keeping their time. And we need to make sure for DCAA purposes that we have true and accurate time records. So if an employee, an employee is taking care of their kids, and yet you see their time cards come in and they say 8 to 4, Monday through Friday, you might want to reach out to that employee and say, okay, you might have put in your 8 hours every day, but was it really 8 to 4? Or was it some combination of, 8 to 10, 12 to 3, and then 7 p.m. to midnight? I mean, it's really important that that you think about and question employees. Again, employees are going to be a little bit jittery right now to let you think that they are doing anything but being superstars. And taking care of kids and working is very challenging. So it's okay to follow up with employees and say, are you sure this is what you wanted to submit? And it just needs to be true and accurate. For hourly employees, obviously, we're always concerned about overtime. We want to make sure they understand that the overtime and approval policies still apply. So if somebody's logging 14-hour days, we need to call them and talk to them about it, just like we would if they were logging unauthorized overtime when they're at work. If you think somebody is working overtime, in other words, they maybe have email on their phone now and they didn't have that before, or they're accessing email late at night but not logging that time, that's also a concern. Out of difficult economic times comes litigation, and it's not going to be an issue until that person goes sideways with you, you have to terminate them, and then all of a sudden you have a Department of Labor complaint. So you want to make sure that supervisors are carefully watching, not to necessarily police or create an unsavory culture, but to make sure that employees know to record their actual hours, and if they work any overtime, that they need to record it, even if it wasn't pre-approved, and that you can deal with the pre-approval issues in another way through your disciplinary process, reminding employees how it works a number of different ways. But we want to make sure that even in a remote environment, we're not turning a blind eye to any types of irregularities in timesheets, because it's a wage and hour problem with DOL, and it can be a problem on the DCAA side as well. We're also still always, looking at discrimination and disparate treatment. So when you're deciding who can be at home and who cannot be at home or might otherwise be furloughed, you want to look at the impact of that decision on your workforce for discrimination and disparate treatment reasons. So, for example, if you had to if you were looking at, okay, I've got to lay off half my workforce, and you just happened to lay off every single person that had kids and was going to take FCRA, sick and safe leave, you might have a discrimination or retaliation problem on your hands, because it optically is not a great situation to have everybody that's going to take protected leave laid off or terminated at the same time. Same with anybody over the age of 40 or women or minorities, right? We want to make sure that in layoff situations or in deciding on working conditions that we are looking at the ultimate impact our decisions make. We also want, as I mentioned before, want to make sure that employees working from home, if they're texting one another, calling one another, having Zoom happy hours together, they understand that our discrimination and harassment policies still apply to our workforce. We're also thinking about workers' compensation. I get a lot of questions about whether COVID will be reportable if somebody gets COVID at home. And generally speaking, that's not going to be the case, but it is a valid question. And there is some guidance from the Department of Labor on that. Generally, what we're worried about is that if somebody does injure themselves while they're at home, and there's case law in different states about, so-and-so was walking downstairs to get lunch, tripped and fell, that would be an employee injury that needs to be reported. And that employee needs to know that if they're injured while in the course of performing their work, even if they're performing work at home, that needs to be reportable. And then we can talk with the insurance company about their position for compensating that injury, but we want people to report injuries just like they would report them if they were at the work site. With respect to COVID and workers' compensation, it's a very high threshold. You basically have to show that you contracted it while at work from somebody who was at work. That's going to be very difficult for most people to show. So right now, if somebody's at home and they've sheltered in place for 2 weeks or more, chances are they're not going to meet that standard, and their contracting COVID would not be reportable or compensable. But if there is a situation where you have an outbreak at a work site or something like that, it might be reportable, it might not be compensable. So it's a good idea to still encourage people to tell you if they have an issue or an injury or an illness that might need to be reported under workers' compensation. We're always looking at the ADA, FMLA, and sick leave. I talked a little bit about the FCRA leave, the extended emergency family and sick leave, and how that might tie in with remote workers, particularly with respect to intermittent leave for teleworkers. And again, that's all at the discretion of the employer to decide that they will allow it. You also should be thinking about the ADA and reasonable accommodation. So the question of the week is, employees are coming to their supervisors and saying, I have a compromised immune system, I can't be at this work site, you have to let me work from home. Or all these federal employees are working from home, why can't I work from home? And the response is often, the contracting officer hasn't let you work from home if you're a federal contractor, right? And so I'm limited in my ability to give you the authorization to work from home at this point in time. If that person has an underlying condition, there is some sense that they might qualify under the ADA and may ask you for a reasonable accommodation. So for example, if somebody said, I have a heart condition, and so my heart condition is my disability, occasionally it affects my life and how I work, and this particular situation is exacerbating that, or could exacerbate that condition, so I would like a reasonable accommodation. Well, in certain circumstances, that could qualify as a perfectly legitimate reasonable accommodation request under the ADA. The question is, can that person perform their essential job duties and their essential functions if they're at home? And so you would go through that analysis, and it may or may not turn out that you need to grant the accommodation. If the contract doesn't allow for telework, your hands are kind of tied, except that you might again need to go out to the contracting officer and request authorization under the ADA for that person to telework. So these are complicated scenarios that are coming up, particularly because folks are worried. And again, a lot of empathy right now for people that have to report to work sites while the rest of us can be at our homes. So I certainly feel for them, but there are similarly just some restrictions that we can't get around, and folks will have to go to work. And we talked a bit already about data privacy and how important that is. That is also important when you're talking about federal government contracts and the requirements for data privacy on federal government contracts. Data privacy considerations for your employees under state law. Before COVID took over everything, a lot of us were still talking about breaches and hacking, right? And those types of schemes are alive and well and running rampant, in this environment, right? Leave it to the scam artists to take advantage of people's fear and vulnerabilities during this time. That's exactly what they do, right? So you don't want to run into a situation where someone in your organization has a lot of your private data or data that needs to be protected on their local drives at home, and they get hacked. So how are you helping your employees to maintain the integrity of your data privacy while they're working remotely? If you have an insurance policy, a cyber policy, it's a good idea to check that policy and see if there are limitations if you have people working remotely, or what the impact could be if there is a hack that exposes you to additional risk. It's really critical to keep the team together, and this is the fluffy part of the presentation, I think, but I really do think from a legal perspective that keeping your team cohesive and maintaining the culture of your organization will help you reduce claims, will help the ease of administration of your programs and human resources in general. So it's one of those areas that's, I can't give you an ROI number, return on investment figure for keeping your team cohesive. But in my experience, if your culture is such that you have encouraged that team building, people are more likely to come to you if there's an issue, and you can cut off the issues early. So the key is communicating frequently and often with your team. Again, it's a good idea to have key contacts within your organization, and those key contacts are reaching out to your team members on a frequent basis. Find ways to connect to the team that are different than normal, right? You can't walk around the office and stand by the water cooler or the coffee machine or whatever it might be anymore. So you've got to find ways to connect, and it might not be a virtual happy hour. It might be a chat function like Slack that you've never used before or something like that. Ways for you to be in constant communication and encouraging some banter other than here's this email, respond to this email. My husband was joking recently that we feel like we're busier now that we're at home, and it, is it because of just this heightened level of productivity? Everybody's at home just really focused on work, and there isn't a lot of that banter happening, right? So I think right now I just had, we have one more question I'm going to go over, and if you have any other questions, feel free. Again, we scheduled this for an hour, but also indicated that it would probably be a little bit shorter. I wanted to give a lot of time for questions, so feel free to answer questions at any point. And if you have follow-up questions that I don't get to on the webinar, I'm happy to answer them as they come in. So the next question I have is, you have full-time salaried employees, they're working less because of the school closure situation, they can't put in full-time hours. Are they obligated to fill in full-time hours, either using their COVID leave or PTO, given that they're supposed to be paid full-time, even for a part-day work? That is the policy for many employers, right? That if you're salaried, even if you're working full-time, you need to figure out a way to make sure that you get to your hours expectation for the day. That's very common in government contracting, not always the case everywhere. So for some organizations, you don't have to record 8 hours every single day. Some days you're going to record 6, and other days you're going to record 10. Or in some organizations, if you're salaried, you don't have to record your time. You just have to get your deliverables done. But in government contracting, it's very common and required to keep that time. And so the answer is you don't necessarily have to have employees record 8 hours, but it could impact some of your operations or your billing or a number of other things. So it's very common for organizations to say you record the time that you work, and then any other time you need to use COVID leave or PTO. So what would happen in that situation if somebody's out of COVID leave and taking, or maybe it wasn't because they have a childcare situation, they have some other situation and they're not putting in the full-time hours they need to, but they don't have PTO, or they're not, they don't qualify for COVID leave. In those situations, you could either have them run into the negative or flex out their hours throughout the week. So that would be an option as well. And then for folks that have leave, they obviously, if they're taking COVID leave, they need to record that. And if it is under that emergency family or sick leave, it's really important that you have charge codes set up specifically for each of those kinds of leave, so you can calculate how much that person is owed for that leave. And this is not intended to be a FICRA webinar by any stretch of the imagination. I'm happy to answer those questions if you guys have them, but this is essentially, this would be an intermittent leave situation where somebody would maybe put in 5 or 6 hours a day and then put in the remainder of FICRA, extended FMLA leave for the care of a child, and they would get 2/3 of that proportionate pay, up to $200 a day maximum, and then they'd have a total benefit cap for reimbursement by the government. So yes, the answer to that question is you can do it that way. You don't necessarily have to do it that way, as long as an employee doesn't receive a salary deduction based on hours worked. All right, what if an employee is working on a government site where the employer is unable to control the work environment? You don't have the ability to clean the work site. What's the liability in a workers' comp claim against the employer? Any proactive steps the employer should take? So the first thing I wanted to mention is that OSHA has a pretty good set of guidelines up on their website that talk about the level of risk of an employer and what measures that employers should be taking given the level of risk at any particular site. Most employers, particularly that are government contractors, are low-risk sites. And the requirement is not that you have to, grade A clean everything. In fact, at most government sites, there are cleaning contractors that clean those sites on a regular basis. You can provide equipment for employees to clean their sites, assuming you can get it. So you might want to have things like, cleaner available so that people can keep their workstations clean, hand wash, but it's generally just encouraging all the things that we've talked about. The liability, though, is pretty low for employers on the whole. So you're not, an employee isn't, if they contracted COVID while they're at work, we're not even sure to what degree insurance companies would consider that compensable at this point. This workers' comp is state by state, and that showing is really high. For example, you don't get reports of workers' comp claims now just because somebody gets the flu or pneumonia. So we think that the guidance right now is that standard is going to be very high to meet for COVID to be a compensable injury. That said, OSHA highly recommends that you encourage social distancing. If you have a lot of people in one space, that you consider whether you can work with the contracting officer to spread people out or alternate shifts to keep people apart. That's not an OSHA requirement, it's just guidelines, and that people practice just safe hygiene and social distancing while they're at work. So the liability is low, but we are getting a lot of questions from employees about, are you doing enough? Is this a safe environment? And certainly we want to be, make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing. Unfortunately, it tends to be the same thing that the government keeps telling you: wash your hands, clean your workstations, don't, touch your nose, things like that. But the liability overall is pretty low. Another question is, what about hazard pay related to COVID? Right now, all indications are that you've probably been hearing a lot about, I know Whole Foods employees are talking about whether they should get some sort of hazard pay. Instacart employees we're talking about whether they should get some type of hazard pay. There's no requirement to pay hazard pay because of COVID. It's not there. So, but there might be realities in your workforce about getting people to continue to come to work if they don't feel like they're being compensated. Some of it's going to depend on the industry that you're in. You could try to negotiate something with your contracting officer, but at this point in time, you wouldn't necessarily be required to provide hazard pay, and it's not necessarily compensable under your government contracts. So another person asked, we have a policy of recording 8 hours per day. If somebody fills in 5 hours a day with COVID leave, can we make them fill out the remaining 3 hours with their own PTO? I am not quite sure why they would fill in 5 hours with COVID leave. So one kind of follow-up question to that would be, it depends. If this is a situation where somebody is taking intermittent leave because they can telework, you would presumably see 5 hours of COVID leave and 3 hours of telework. If this is a situation where they're taking COVID leave because of their own illness, or they're taking care of somebody else, or they can't telework, and that's why they're at home taking care of kids or whatever the case might be, the Department of Labor has said that COVID leave can only be taken in full day increments. So you wouldn't have a partial day in that particular case. If it's a case where somebody's filling in 5 hours a day in COVID leave because they know they're only going to get 2/3 pay, up to $200 or $500 for their incident, so they put in 3 hours of their own PTO, all indications are that you could allow them to take their own PTO, but you can't necessarily force them to take their own PTO. So it can be a complicated answer. It depends on why they're taking leave and whether they can telework or not. and a number of other factors. And so if you have particular questions about specific instances, please let me know. But you know, that's the long way of saying it depends on why they're taking the leave, as to whether they have to take a full day absence in order to qualify for the COVID leave in the first place. So another question is, given this is a federally recognized pandemic, if an employee is claiming telework due to quarantine or illness, is the employer permitted to ask if the employee is presumptively or confirmed diagnosed with COVID-19, so the employee may notify other employees that they've come into contact with? This is less about being a federally recognized pandemic, although that certainly plays into the EEO guidelines and guidance that we can ask more about an employee's condition that we might otherwise be able to ask before. So even if somebody's not teleworking, you can ask, the EEOC has said that you can ask if the employee is confirmed to be diagnosed or exhibiting even symptoms of COVID-19. So that you can alert other employees that they might have come into contact. The biggest issue here is privacy, right? So you need to determine whether it's necessary to tell others that they work with that it was, you know, person A, Mary on the 5th floor, or is it a case where you can say, hey, somebody on the 5th floor on this date was in the office on this date and now has symptoms of COVID. You know, this is how we're going to address it. Everybody on the 5th floor is going to quarantine or shelter in place, or in order to further prevent the spread. So it's really important that you take a look. You can ask the question to people. When you get the information back in that indicates somebody might have an infection, the question is, you know, how far do we have to go to make sure we keep others safe versus protecting the privacy of that individual? So there, somebody asked about cost-saving measures such as mandatory PTO. There are employers that, if they would otherwise have to furlough people, they're making them go on furlough, but or mandatory PTO. That depends in large part on your policy. So you want to have somebody take a look at your policy and discuss with you whether or not your policy would allow you to force somebody to take PTO. But generally speaking, you can force PTO on folks. They're not happy about it, but you can use that, generally speaking. But I would encourage you to review your policy. The next question is, should we create a separate billing code to record COVID-19 sick leave or family leave, or use our current sick billing code? I would highly encourage you to create separate billing codes, because it's going to be important for recovering that amount from the IRS, that you keep track of, you know, what amount was sick leave for taking care of others, which is only eligible for 2/3 pay up to $200 a day. Was it their own care, which is eligible for $511 per day at full pay? Or is this extended family medical leave, which is 2/3 pay up to $200 a day? It's going to be important that you keep track of the reasons for leave and documentation. So I'd highly suggest you set up separate billing codes for that. The next question is the COVID sick pay in addition to any other state mandated sick time, or does it run concurrently? Right now, this is in addition to any other state mandated sick time. All indications in the law, there's a specific provision in the law that says this is in addition to what is already provided. So the information that we have now is that it's going to be in addition to. A next question, and this has kind of turned into a little bit of COVID extended family leave and sick time stuff, but that's perfectly okay. I'm happy to answer those questions. Is COVID extended family leave in addition to the typical family FMLA leave? And the answer to that question is no. That if somebody has already taken their FMLA leave, they're not going to get a second bite at the apple, and they're not going to get an additional 12 weeks. So for some people, that's going to really impact their ability to get that leave. Right now, that's all the questions that I have, and we're coming, you know, fairly close to the end of the hour, but I know we all have busy schedules, so I'm not going to keep you any longer. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And if you have more questions about FCRA or specifically CARE, the stimulus package that was passed last week, we have a webinar tomorrow that myself and two of my colleagues, Sai Alba and Dave Schaefer, are going to be on. We have been digging into 900 pages of legislation and have been fielding a lot of your questions about what's in the CARE Act and how to cope with it. And we are going to try to dive into some of those FAQs tomorrow and give you a sense of what's in there and what resources might be available to you by virtue of that particular act. So please join us tomorrow at 1:30 Eastern Time for that webinar, and we'd be happy to get your questions there as well. Thank you so much, and I'm going to sign off. I appreciate you joining me today, and I will do the legal disclaimer that nothing in this webinar was legal advice and it didn't create attorney-client privilege, because I've got to do that. And if you have specific questions or specific situations that you want to tackle, please consult with your trusted advisor, and we hope we can be that for you. And have a good day. Stay safe, everyone, and don't go crazy sheltering in place. Bye now.